Hey guys, it's Melissa Moore. Thanks for joining me on today's episode of Faith, Hope, Love, where we grow together in our faith, increase in hope, and learn how to better love God and love other people. On today's episode, we are in the middle of our Enneagram series, and we are joined by special guest, Suzanne Stabile. And I am so overjoyed to be able to share her with you on the show. She has written some really phenomenal books, her first being The Road Back to You, and her second book, The Path Between Us. These are primers to the Enneagram and understanding the way that we've been wired and created by God, as well as how to have healthy relationships. In Suzanne's latest book, The Journey Toward Wholeness, she dives deeply into the ideas of triads and stances and how understanding those helps us to live in seasons of stress, create lives of balance, and achieve transformation. It's such a phenomenal book. Definitely go pick up a copy. But right now, we're going to jump into our episode with Suzanne Stabile. Suzanne, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. Honestly, you're someone that needs no introduction, but if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about yourself before we jump into the book and the obvious question, what is your Enneagram type?
I will start by telling you that in relationship to faith, I have lots of faith in an all-loving, all-benevolent, gracious God. And I think there's grace falling on all of us, and that's been my whole life experience. In terms of hope, my hope is that at 70, I've done some good and meaningful things with my life, including when I taught social issues and social justice in high schools, and when I coached basketball in high school and at SMU, and when I taught Sunday school for 35 years, and when I raised my children, and when I did my best to be a good pastor's wife. And I have a lot of hope for all of that. And hope to be forgiven for all the things I got wrong, and held in affectionately for the things that I did right. And in terms of love, I am literally head over heels in love with my husband. We have 4 children, and they range in age from 33 to 43. And they all have spouses, and we have 9 grandchildren. And if I am and have lived in right relationship in those relationships, then those are the things that will matter that I might be remembered for. I want to be remembered by them, and I want my grandchildren to remember pieces of what I tried to teach them. And I want my love with and for my husband to be the most important part of our ministry, and everything else follows after that. I've also been working with the Enneagram for 30 years, very secondary to the first 3 things I talked about. And I have been blessed to have been working with it long enough that I learned from some of the best. And after 30 years, I think I'm adding a new perspective to a body of work that is its own thing. And my husband, Joe, always says that he hopes that he's been faithful. He knows that God has always been faithful to him. And I would have to say I feel the same way. And all the other stuff is just doing life, and everybody has their own struggles and their own successes and the things that they're proud of. And I honestly think everybody's doing pretty much the best they can. And we all just have different gifts and different offerings.
I mean, it's been a really hard year, but, obviously I've loved over the last, couple years reading your books. I feel like I've kind of come to know you a little bit, and just kind of seeing how, obviously you sharing about the health of your family relationships. I'm sure so much of that comes back to, your own personal work and being able to see the best in the people around you and being able to love them well. And you are an Enneagram too, right?
I am.
I love it. And I mean, it really comes out in your books as just hearing the way that you write, it really comes out. It's just so beautiful. Just the way that you love people, again, not just those in your immediate life, but that you've poured out into all the communities that you've been in over the years. So again, I just have so much respect for you. And I'm so thankful again for the opportunity just to chat with you. I really would love to dive into your book. I love how the first two are kind of these primers and how to like understand ourselves, basically in the Enneagram, how to understand the people around us. But then I love how in this book you've really, you kind of talk about us living in this liminal time with COVID. And, we've all gone through some really intense experiences together, a lot of trauma, as well as, again, being in this in-between time, there's like a lack of clarity on what the future holds. Would you kind of talk about how, with this idea of stress in the Enneagram, how do you see that coming out in COVID? And are there things that we can almost learn from this last season?
Let's define liminality for just a minute. Liminal space is when you're on the threshold, essentially. It's when you're not where you were and you're not where you're going. And I actually sold this book to IVP before COVID because I was sure that liminality at different times is part of everybody's life. So when COVID hit, I thought, oh man, I missed it. I'm late. But I've revised that now, and I don't think I'm late because now everybody knows what I'm talking about, and not just people who could identify liminality in their own lives. And it's a very uncomfortable space. It causes stress for everyone to be on the threshold, to not be where they were and not where they're going. And we have 3 different responses to that. And of course, they're Enneagram specific. The response for aggressive numbers, which are 3s, 7s, and 8s, is that they just want to leave that liminal space and run ahead and create something new. And they want to create something that is their own idea of what we could have done, should have done, can do, and it's going to be so great. Unfortunately, sometimes they don't bring enough of the past with them, and they don't allow for enough questioning around, well, is this really a good idea? And what about these people? And what about these people over here? So there's that response. People who are a little more hesitant and a little more withdrawing by nature, which would be 4s, 5s, and 9s, when they find themselves in liminality, they want to go back to the way things used to be. It's like, and I'm a pastor's wife, so I hear it a lot. And it's, why can't we just do things like we were doing them before? Why can't we just go back to the way things used to be? And the reason we can't is because what used to be, it is no more. And it's not about relevance, it's about reality. It's about people have changed, and things have changed, and time has gone by. And honestly, there is no back to normal. There's only an understanding of what normal means today and what normal will look like weeks from today. And I understand the responses of both. 1s, 2s, and 6s are a little more comfortable right there on the threshold than the other 6 numbers. And it's because they are dependent on other people for their way of being in the world. And it doesn't mean that they're not independent, that they can't make it on their own. But it means that they depend on the responses of other people and the needs of other people and questions and concerns from other people. And so to get that worked out makes them a little more comfortable waiting a bit before moving forward. Added to that, I would say that I think we are more dualistic than we've ever been as a global culture and as an American culture. And that means duality is when things are either good or bad, right or wrong. You're either a friend or an enemy. And non-duality is you could be a friend and enemy at times, and it could be right today and wrong tomorrow. And so it's the difference between either or and both and. And we're kind of stuck right now in a collective community that is also stuck in dualistic thinking. Either it's this way or it's wrong, and it's not serving us very well. So, in exploring liminality and my response to that, I was immediately aware that I needed to revisit the 3 centers of intelligence that are common understanding, not just for Enneagram wisdom, but for all different kinds of philosophies and ways of being. There was a resurgence. The Enneagram's really old. I don't know how old, and if I say a number, then you'll get emails that say, how does she know it's that number? So I'm going to save you all that and just say it's old. It's really old. Older than you think old. And in the 1940s and 1950s, there was kind of a revival of Enneagram conversation and teaching and work. And the contributors to that were a guy named George Gurdjieff, who is has been given the title of being the grandfather of the modern Enneagram. 2 of his students were big time involved, adding their own work to his work, and they were Claudio Naranjo and Oscar Ichazo. And at the same time that they were doing their work, there was a man in England whose name was Maurice Nicole, and he started publishing papers about the reality that there are 3 centers of intelligence, and they are thinking, feeling, and doing. So with those 3 centers, then, if you overlay that on the Enneagram, then what you find out is that there are 3 numbers that are thinking dominant, 3 numbers that are feeling dominant, and 3 numbers that are doing dominant. And when something perfectly fits with another system, then it validates both. And my way of beginning to talk about all of that is that all of us, when we respond to stimulus from outside of us, respond first with either what do I think, what do I feel, or what am I going to do? And after that, the other 2 centers come into play. Maurice Nicole was not necessarily talking about the Enneagram, but what he was saying was acceptable to everybody. Nobody else said, no, there are 4 centers of intelligence, or there are 7. So we ended up with those 3 and common language around how to work with that. At the same time, there was a German-American woman whose name was Karen Horney. And Karen Horney said, people respond to other people in one of 3 ways. They either move toward other people, they move away from other people, or they move against other people. So if you lay Karen Horney's work on top of the Enneagram, then what you get is 3 numbers that move toward people, 3 numbers that move away from people, and 3 numbers that move against other people. Now, I've changed the language move against. My teaching, any wisdom that I have that I'm adding to a body of Enneagram knowledge that's much bigger than I am, I think comes from the fact that I do 8-hour workshops or all weekend workshops. And I do workshops generally for a small enough group of people that I get to listen to their answers to questions. And I get to learn from them about their number instead of all of my knowledge of the Enneagram being me from my 2 perspectives saying how another number responds to life. So that's been a gift for me, and they are all to be credited with all that they've taught me. And what 3s, 7s, and 8s, who are the numbers that historically would be said move against other people, what I've learned from them is that that's not actually true. They stand independently. And it feels to us like they're moving against us because they're not moving with us. And so I that move against doesn't work for me anymore. And so I don't use that language anymore. But it's still the historical language that's in Enneagram work. So it seemed to me that if the 9 Enneagram numbers in their definition lend themselves to thinking, feeling, and doing, and to moving toward, moving away from, and standing independently, that was the work that I needed to unpack for my new book. And in unpacking that, I have some, I think, helpful things to say.
I know with myself reading this, I'm a 3. And so I thought I was a 2 for a very long time, but I've really reading this has helped me to understand. You kind of talk in the section on stances about this idea that even though I'm in this heart or feeling triad, I tend to, when I'm feeling anxious or feeling stressed by circumstances that are outside my control, I tend to go straight into doing and thinking, which seems counterintuitive as a feeler. Again, this book, I feel like you've gone so in depth, and it's helped me to understand my friends and my family that have responded differently to COVID than I have. And, being able to, instead of saying, well, this is why you feel what you do, I can ask them questions. And instead of this being a gap between us, it's able to help us to have greater conversations of how to live in the now, understand what's happened in the past, and then also move forward together. So I've loved your book.
Sure.
I've so loved it.
Thank you. That's exciting for me. All right. Well, I'm going to talk about triads for just a second, and then I'm going to talk about stances for just a minute. I'm going to talk about orientation to time for just a minute, and then I'm going to talk about stress and security.
I love it. Let's go.
For just a minute.
That's perfect.
All right. Here we go. So, triads, there are a lot of 3s in the Enneagram. There are just lots of 3s. They're in many places, and there's a lot to say about that, but we don't have time. So what I am going to say is 2s, 3s, and 4s make up the heart triad or the feeling triad, and that's because they're feeling dominant. However, 3s are both feeling dominant and feeling repressed, so I'm going to come back and talk about that in a few minutes. 5s, 6s, and 7s make up the thinking triad or the head triad, and that's because they think first, so they're thinking dominant. However, 6s are both thinking dominant and thinking repressed. Moving on around, 8s, 9s, and 1s are doing dominant, and that's because they respond to everything with what needs to be done, but 9s are both doing dominant and doing repressed. When considering the 3 centers, it turns out, I think, that while there's work to be done in triads, Enneagram gold is in stance work. And I'm so thankful for the people who went before me, who did work with stances, who paved the way so that I could. Hurley and Donson, I think, are perhaps the unsung heroes of the Enneagram in some ways. They didn't have a big voice or a big platform, but they had a really good understanding of stances. Stances are determined not by which of the three centers is dominant, but by which one is repressed. And repressed doesn't mean that you don't use it. It just means that you don't rely on that center and you tend to use it last. And it's the center that you like the least, and it's the place where you need to do the most work. 3s, 7s, and 8s are referred to as aggressive numbers because they're in the aggressive stance. Now, if you'll just think for a second, that means that when this work was overlaid on top of the Enneagram, there was one number in each triad that makes up each of the three stances. That's remarkable. That kind of synchronicity you can't argue with. You just can't. All right, so we're going to do the 3 first because that's you. And you are both feeling dominant and feeling repressed. And what that means is that you use feeling to take in information, but you don't use feelings to process or make sense of the information that you've taken in. 3s find feelings to be messy and unpredictable, and they interrupt what's already happening. And so 3s tend to take in the information with feelings and just set them to the side. And they're planning to go back and pick them up and deal with all of them. But they get involved in so many things, they just don't usually get that done. So they are feeling dominant and feeling repressed. 7s are thinking dominant and feeling repressed. And what that means is that 7s essentially have a half range of feelings instead of a full range. And they like to hang out in the happy half of life, the hopeful future, where everything's going to be great. And so they're kind of always a couple of steps ahead. But there's a great deal to be learned in the other half range of feelings. In fact, most life lessons are learned in the other half. And so what 7s have to do is figure out how to include a full range of feelings in their responses to life. 8s are also feeling repressed. They're doing dominant and feeling repressed. And they kind of fool themselves. 8s are either all in or they're not in at all. And so lust, in the sense of expansion of everything, is the passion or the sin for 8s. And that's because they want everything to be bigger and they think they can make it bigger, and they're often correct. They often can. But feelings are problematic if that's your agenda. And so 8s find that they have a lot of energy, which they fool themselves and sometimes other people into thinking that those are emotions. And they're not. They're just a lot of lust for a lot of different things. Orientation of time is real important. So I'm going to overlay it right here on top of what's happening in relationship to these 3 numbers. And that is that their orientation to time is the future. And that means that they tether themselves to what's about to happen instead of to what's happening right now or what's already happened. 4s, 5s, and 9s make up the withdrawing stance. And they're doing repressed. And they don't like to hear that at all because they will immediately say, I do stuff all the time. I'm always doing. But in fact, there's some struggle with that for them. So 4s are, in fact, always doing, but they're kind of doing what they love or what they want to do. And 5s spend most of their time planning to do. Like that feels like doing to them if they're planning what they're going to do. 9s are very aware of what needs to be done, but it often doesn't occur to them that they're the ones who are supposed to do it. So that makes up the stance that is withdrawing, and that's just a thumbnail sketch. There's, as you know, way more to learn about that. 1s, 2s, and 6s are thinking repressed. And no number likes what I say about them. If I say they're feeling repressed, they don't like that. If I say they're doing repressed, they don't like that. I do think thinking repressed people have a little bit of an edge, because you can tell when people aren't feeling, and you can tell when people don't get their stuff done. But when people aren't thinking, you got to know them pretty well to know that that's what's happening. So, that's a gift and a problem, probably. Ones consider all of that inner dialogue with their critic to be thinking. And that's not thinking. That's an inner dialogue with a voice that nobody else hears. It's not thinking. Twos say, oh, I think all the time. I think all the time. And that's true. 85% of the time about relationships. And there are other things that need to be thought about. And sixes spend much of their thinking time planning for what could go wrong and having a plan for how they're going to address what could go wrong if what could happen happens. And so none of those are productive thinking. So as I started maybe 22 years ago to have an opportunity, I don't get to do it anymore, to work with people who worked together in twos or couples, I found out that most of the complaints, if I got through everything, were about what's lacking in the other person, not about what's dominant. And that an awful lot had to do with orientation to time. 3s, 7s, and 8s, orientation to time is the future. And they like to plan for the future, talk about the future, affect the future, live in the future. And they are not good at self-reflection about the past. And they're impatient with what's happening in the present moment. 4s, 5s, and 9s are tethered to the past. And that means that they don't want to run ahead too quick. They want to think things through based on what's tried and true from what's already happened in the past. And if you listen to them, they have a lot of references to things that happened when they were children or on a vacation or in their past job or things like that. 1s, 2s, and 6s, orientation to time is the present moment. And they have to be very careful with that because they are dependent on what other people are doing and how other people are responding in the present moment. Each of those examples of a lack of balance explain an awful lot to the problems that we have in relationships. And if you put an aggressive number whose orientation to time is the future with a withdrawing number whose orientation to time is the past, there's a disconnect that has to be overcome in order for that relationship to work. My husband's a United Methodist pastor, and in our denomination, we're appointed by the bishop. And I've had the gift for the last maybe 5 years of getting to work with some leadership teams from all over the country from the United Methodist Church, trying to say, if you appoint a pastor whose orientation to time is the future to a church whose orientation to time is the past, then you have a disconnect that has to be made up for somewhere. And the same is true in any other relationship that we might want to talk about. If I had to say that there's one word that describes the work we need to do with the Enneagram, it would be balance. We all need to balance things. And we need to balance these 3 centers of intelligence. And in order to do good Enneagram work, you don't try to push anything down. You try to bring up other things to balance it instead. So, the first part of my new book has to do with how to manage your dominant center. And that doesn't mean how to squelch it. It doesn't mean how to push it down or how to tame it. It means how to manage it. And if you're a 2, 3, or a 4, you got to learn how to manage your feelings or you can't do the rest of the work. And 5s, 6s, and 7s have to manage thinking, and 8s, 9s, and 1s have to manage doing. When it comes to trying to do the work to bring up your repressed center, it's hard. It's really hard. And it's hard to talk yourself into doing it because it's so easy to say, I got this far doing what I was doing. I'm doing pretty good. I think I'm okay. But where we're not okay is that if you bring in the reality of the intuitive Enneagram moves that occur in times of stress and times of security, then things get a little more complex than what I've always done works and I'm doing okay. Because a new depth in relationships brings new problems and needs new solutions and has new potential. And we have to do the work to be able to live into the potential that we have as individuals and in relationships with other people. I believe with everything in me that there is nothing in the Enneagram that is not Christian. And I've done lots of interviews with lots of people. And they all want to know what most want to know what's dangerous about the Enneagram. And here it is. What's dangerous about the Enneagram is that you take it to be more than it is. It's one really wonderful spiritual tool that helps better than anything else I know with self-awareness and with intentionality and with self-knowledge. And I'm sure that you can't change what you can't name. And one of the things that the Enneagram does for us is name things that when we hear it about us, we know it's true. It's like you hear it and you know it's true. Now, if I'm teaching and you know it's true, but you don't like it, then you may push back. But it doesn't work because the people who know it's true. And Life in the Trinity Ministries has become a place for adults to gain tools for wisdom that will help them in their relationship with God, with themselves, and with other people. And the Enneagram is one piece of that, and it is a piece that works best with other spiritual practices. So what's dangerous about it, again, is that you take it to be more than it is. It's just one spiritual practice. And if you go deep enough, it gets really challenging. It's not really about what Halloween costume you're going to pick or your favorite vacation spot or what kind of coffee you like. It's about who you were created to be and how, if you learn to name that and work with the wisdom that the Enneagram offers to you, along with other spiritual practices, you can be more of who you essentially are and less of who your personality names you to be. And that, I think, is transformation. And I think we're looking for that. We're looking to be better people. Right? Like that's just it. I want to be better tomorrow than I am today. I want to be kinder. I want to have more faith. I want to be more loving. I want to be more hopeful. We want all of that, but you have to do some work to get there. So, part of what I tried to do in the new book is say, here are some things you can do to manage your dominant center. And then a good chunk of the book gets to here's the things you can do to bring up your repressed center, but in between is this little sweet work of stress and security. And what the Enneagram organically hands to us is a move on the Enneagram that's likely to occur either intentionally, we can learn to do that, or organically when we're really stressed, and another move that is likely to occur when we're feeling secure. And traditional Enneagram teaching was that you always go to the low, unhealthy side of the number that you move to in stress, and you go to the high, healthy side of the number that you move to in security. And after 20 years of Enneagram work, I woke up one day and thought that just can't be. And that can't be because the Enneagram is always helpful. So I'm a 2, which means I go to 8 in stress. When I'm stressed out in 2 and then I go to the unhealthy side of 8, that's not helpful. On the other hand, when I use what I've learned from the high side of 8, it's very helpful because your stress point has this behavior pattern that's found in another number that you have to take care of yourself. Without the number that you go to in stress, you can't take care of yourself. And without the number that you go to in security, you can't experience holistic healing. You got to have both. And you have to learn to access the best of both. And that's work. It's just work. And right now, life is very stressful.
I love how, in the book, you really kind of, again, obviously talking about the triads and stances, but you almost, in a way, you allow us to find unity between the different numbers because you show, I guess, like the blessings that each number brings to the table. And I think a lot of times when I first started studying the Enneagram, it was so easy for me to look at the negative side of my number or seeing, for as a 3 going in stress to 9, the negative side of 9. And now I think, again, by reading your book, the latest one, it has really opened my eyes to, man, as a 3, instead of retreating into my 9 in a way that's unhealthy and, numbing out or whatever, I can rest. And I think your book so well unpacks that for each of the numbers. I know we don't have a ton of time left. I would love just to really kind of wrap up on this idea of how those spiritual disciplines, kind of like how you shared your husband, kind of had honed in on those for many, many years in ministry, but how we use spiritual disciplines to allow us to access that repressed stance, as well as, just to be able to grow in times of stress, create more balance. And, do you have any suggestions maybe for each type of a special spiritual gift that you would ask them to kind of hone in on? Obviously, you unpack it a lot in the book, but if you have one that you would like to kind of recommend to each.
All right, before I do that, I want to do this. If I had to have brain surgery, I would want a 1 to do it. And if I had to go through a long rehab, I would want a 2 nurse. And if I came out of that and wanted to reshape and rebuild my work based on what I had learned, I would want a 3 to help me do that. And if I felt like life was gray and lacking color and not textured enough for me, I would want a 4 in my life to offer me all of that. And if I needed to find the truth about my place in a conflictual situation, I would want a 5 to talk to me about that, because 5s are the only number on the Enneagram that are truly capable of being neutral, which means ultimately that's where you get the truth. And if we were coming back out of COVID in Life in the Trinity Ministry, I would want 6s at the table, because 6s are the number that's most concerned about the common good. And I, in that same context, would want 7s, because we need to do something creative and new and kind of exciting. And there are a lot of things wrong in the world, a lot of things wrong. And I started out teaching theology in a Catholic high school, teaching social issues and social justice. And there is no number on the Enneagram who addresses social justice like 8s do, because 8s are the only number on the Enneagram who have a heart for the underdog, but who have the courage to take on oppressors. And 9s are the only number on the Enneagram that see at least 2 sides to everything. And we need that desperately in our culture and in our world, because there's always more than one side. Having said all of that, I feel like I've tipped my hat to every number and to all the goodness that's there. I think I want to talk about spiritual practices first in terms of stances, and then if we have time, we'll pull the numbers out and do a little work with that. I feel like up until now, people who are listening to the podcast are going to kind of like me, and that may stop now. So maybe hear it all the way through and then go back and listen to the first part. Because spiritual practices begin, I believe, Joe and I believe, with one practice that everybody needs to find a way to include. And lots of numbers, every number doesn't like it, and they don't like it for different reasons, and I'm sorry. But a contemplative sit or a contemplative practice, a time of contemplative silence every day is necessary. But what is astonishing to me is doing a contemplative sit every morning, and sometimes another one in the afternoon, has completely changed my life for the better. And yet, I still am willing to leave home without doing my sit, but never without doing my hair. Sadly. And so, what I think we all have to get to is we're willing to leave our spiritual practice till tomorrow in order to do these other things. And I'm right in there with you. So what that means is you're going to have to change your schedule a little bit. And if you don't know anything about a daily sit or a contemplative sit or contemplative prayer, it's called, honestly, Joe teaches it better than anybody I know. And you can get that at lifeinthetrinityministry.com. There are other really good teachers. Contemplative Outreach has really good teachers. That's a good place to go to look for a good teacher. Joe learned what he knows from Richard Rohr and Thomas Keating, mostly from Thomas Keating, and nobody tops the work that he's left for us. Once you are willing to commit to that, and many of you won't, I already know because I've been telling people for years, and people just don't seem to be able to accommodate that, and that's okay too. Then you need to incorporate other spiritual practices. And the reality is that you need a practice that's comforting. So a spiritual practice can be anything that makes you feel closer to God. It can be baking bread, it can be gardening, it can be a walk, it can be all kinds of things that help you get in touch with who you are and who God is and who you are in relationship to God. And that will change from time to time. But if you only do what's comfortable after you've made space for God with a contemplative practice of some kind. And by the way, if Joe was here, he would say, just think about it as you and God are going to go sit on rocking chairs on the front porch. And God's going to be there every day at whatever time you ask God to come. And all you have to do is show up and be quiet. And nothing big's going to happen. It won't be lightning. Angels probably won't appear. There won't be confetti. But you will find after a time that if you do that, then the rest of the work that is your spiritual journey will just be easier. No expectations over here. Just do your sit and then do other things. Find a comforting practice. Mine changes all the time. But you also have to find a challenging practice. And so, for 1s, 2s, and 6s, you have to find a practice that engages thinking. Because feeling and doing and doing and feeling is such fun, it doesn't challenge the third part of you that will bring balance to your life and therefore bring balance to your spiritual life. So, 1s, it would be good for you at some time, not this isn't the only spiritual practice ever. This is just a spiritual practice. It would be good for you to read somebody that you disagree with. That's a good spiritual practice. It would be good for you, if you're a 1, to allow something that you try to make sure is just right every day, that's inconsequential in terms of life and all of that, to be just a little bit off without you fixing it on your way out the door. I also did spiritual direction for a while. I did an Enneagram piece with a real spiritual director. I'm a terrible spiritual director. I think I just need to tell everybody what they need to do, and that should be it. But Joe says that's not really the meaning of spiritual direction. So this other woman and I were doing spiritual direction together, and a 1 was our directee. And my suggestion to her was that she go for a month without making her bed every morning. She had to leave it unmade 1 morning a week. And she just couldn't do it. It took her months to be able. She said, I had to close the door. I changed the day. I tried doing it the same day every week. I tried doing it the day before I came to spiritual direction. I've tried everything. I can't do it. So I'm talking about things that stretch your comfort, right? So maybe don't make your bed every day. Maybe don't clean up your children's rooms. Maybe you let them do that, except for once a week. Maybe. And maybe you do something really deep like read a theologian that you're not sure about or that you're not sure you agree with. Or maybe a politician you're not sure you agree with. Because there's humanity everywhere. 2s. You need to do things that don't involve other people. You just need to find yourself a practice that involves you doing some thankless job somewhere that nobody loves you for. Are you going to like doing it? No. Is it going to be good for you? Yep. It's going to be real good for you. Do silent giving, like drop things off at people's houses and just wait for them to discover it. Have something in your car that you're going to just hand out the window to somebody. Invite somebody to dinner who can never have you back for dinner at their house. 3s. I think the most important spiritual practice that you could begin with that will be a challenge for you is staying present in a conversation with people who overtalk and give you too many examples and repeat themselves. Your impatience with other people's verbal processing is a disconnect. And if you can manage it on your side, you can then have enough grace and patience to teach them to manage it on their side. Be patient with what is and with people as they are before you try to make things better for them. Fours. I hesitate to use the one I'm going to use, but because I don't want you to hear it wrong. So let me say this. Fours who are doing some work consistently say to me, I'm always, now there's a bad word. Always is a bad word. I'm always either too much or not enough. So what I think fours need to do as a spiritual practice to open the door to other spiritual practices is have it be kind of ordinary, so that the depth of the things that you want to talk to other people about isn't quite so deep so early. Most people don't operate on the level of depth of sharing feelings and emotions and stories that you do. And you need an entry level that isn't that deep. So work on finding something else. Same years when the woman couldn't make her bed, this four kept coming to me and saying, what can I do? Tell me what to do. I'll do it. I trust you. I'll do it. And she lived in Mississippi, and she knew the Enneagram before I did, and she was just a phenomenal woman. And unfortunately, sometimes people don't want to talk about things in front of the whole group, so they wait in line a long time to ask me a question. And she was older, and I had a lot of respect for her, and I hated it when she waited in line, but she was waiting in line. And I had arrived in this town in Mississippi to teach that weekend, and I did every year at the same time, with them telling me they were so excited because they had a new Whole Foods grocery store where everything is perfect and beautiful. And she waited in line for me, and then she looked at me and she said, Suzanne, my spiritual life is so dry. I need a practice that will really shake things up for me. And I know God will give it to you. If you'll just tell me what it is, I know I can trust it. And I said, okay. You sure? And she said, yes. And I said, you can't buy groceries for this month at the new Whole Foods. You got to buy groceries at the same old Safeway or Kroger that you've been going to. And she waited a minute and looked at me and said, do you have another one? I said, nope, that's it. And she contacted me, I think she wrote me, I don't remember, and said, that changed everything for me, because I saw the beauty that was where I had always been. Right? Fives. I know how you feel about your privacy, and I respect it. And I know that you have limited energy and that you don't have a lot of extra to give away, and I respect that. But if you can't trust somebody else with the parts of your story that you don't trust anybody else with, you are never going to be able to receive and feel and experience the full measure of God's love for you. Because the way we experience God's love for us is through other people. And, exchanges that are confidential are what build relationships. And as a 5, you're just going to have to risk it. 6s. One of the first things that I suggest for 6s is that they keep a journal of the worst case scenario thing that they think is going to happen and the plan that they have for it. And then they go to the next day and do the same thing, and the next day and do the same thing. And they're not allowed to look back at all the days. They have to keep turning the page, turning the page, turning the page. And after 40 days, Jesus was in the desert for 40 days. You can do 40 days without looking back. For 40 days, you don't look back. And then on day 41, I want you to go back and read each journal entry and see how many of the things that you worried about and planned for and prepared for actually happened. And then give yourself the gift of knowing how much time that cost you from your one wild and precious life. 7s. You know, I think 7s are the one number that gets the least support from the people who are their friends when they try to do some deep spiritual work. When they start trying to hold back a little and not be the life of the party and not add humor to things when things are uncomfortable and all of that, when they start to do those pieces of work, people say to them, "What happened to you? You used to be so much fun. Why are you like this now? What happened to you?" And so 7s, I think before you begin to take on other spiritual practices, you need to take each one of your friends out for coffee or a beer or dinner and a hamburger or whatever. And you need to say, "I need you to let me grow spiritually. And so I need you to support me when I'm not fun and upbeat and the life of the party. And I won't be that way all the time, but I need support for when I'm trying to share a deeper part of me with people that I love and trust." 8s, you ought to go volunteer at a children's hospital. We have a Shriners Hospital here in Dallas where kids are learning to walk with braces because they're missing an arm or a leg or a foot, where children are trying to learn to do things that they've desired to do and can't manage. And if, as an 8, you have the courage to volunteer in such a place, then you will soon realize that it is your inclination to fix everything that's wrong and everything that causes people pain. And what a lovely, lovely desire. But you can't do it. And so you have to learn to be present to pain that you can't fix, to systems that you can't revamp, to children who have so much to teach you. And 9s. 9s avoid conflict at all costs. And honestly, sometimes avoiding conflict causes conflict. I live with a 9. I'm telling you, when he's avoiding conflict, I get more conflictual by the minute. So that is not a good thing. But what avoiding conflict has cost you is your ability to speak up and say what you think and say what you believe and say what you want or desire. And so a good practice for you would be to speak up, to risk disconnection by saying what you believe is true or right, or by just saying what you want. Take a stand. You can change your mind later. Give it a try. If it doesn't work, that's okay. Now, obviously, there are spiritual practices like prayer and examine and welcoming prayer and simplicity and solitude and silence and giving and celebration and all kinds. And I'm not skirting those. I'm trying to set the table for those. Because how we each come to those other practices is usually in average space in our number. And so that's what needs to be addressed first.
I love it. I'm excited to edit this episode so I can just go back and listen again to everything that you just shared. And obviously with the book, I mean, you really do such a deep dive and, multiple different ideas for spiritual practices in the book. But this was just so honest and relatable. And I know I felt called out with my number. And I know that I'm thinking of each of my friends and family members for each number. And I'm like, man, they're not going to like this news. But what a gift this is, just for the chance to really be called out to growth. It's stressful going through what we've gone through this last year, but I think God really desires for us to grow through the stress. There's a verse where it talks about suffering produces perseverance, character, and hope. And I think going through the stress allows us a space, if we let it, to be a space for God to do this transformative work. So I just so appreciate your time, seriously, for meeting with me today and just for sharing some of your book. Obviously, if someone's watching this and this is kind of tickled their ear a little bit, definitely go pick up your copy of the book. It's available anywhere books are sold, and you can dive deeper into the Enneagram. So thank you, Suzanne, for your time.
Oh, you're so welcome. I feel perhaps like I overtalked a little, and I didn't get to hear much from you. The closing thing I would say is that you're beautiful and smart and gracious, and you're a lovely host. Thank you for having me. And the other thing that I would say is that the great spiritual teachers who have talked about liminality say that it is the most teachable space, perhaps the only teachable space. And so I think a question that we all need to ask ourselves is, what are we learning? What am I learning? And what are we learning? And I hope that we will listen closely and recognize the challenge and the grace that's offered with it if we have the courage to ask the question.
Thanks, guys, so much for joining us on the show today for our episode with guest Suzanne Stabile. You can find a copy of her books anywhere the books are sold, and I am so delighted with the opportunity to share her message with you today, and hope that this book will inspire in you a regeneration, a restoration, and a transformation. Thanks, and I'll see you all next week.